Hello, everyone. In this lecture, we will be discussing the Middle Paleolithic, a review of pages 124 through 131 in Chris Scarre's The Human Past. We're discussing in this lecture hominid evolution, the history of humans. In our previous talk about the Lower Paleolithic, we discussed the rise of Australopithecus and the early versions of Homo habilis. Now we will be discussing the end of the evolution of Homo erectus, the emergence out of Africa, and those subsequent hominids that developed during the Middle Paleolithic. In particular, we'll talk about Homo heidelbergensis and this species' predecessors. We'll also be discussing Homo neanderthalensis and the earliest versions of our own genus, our own species, Homo sapiens. There are three fossil groups leading up to modern humans in Africa. Group 1, the early period, between 600 and 250,000 years ago. Fossils that show up during this period are likely early versions of a species known as Homo heidelbergensis. It derives its name from Heidelberg, Germany, where a jawbone was found and first identified as a new species. The group 2, or a transitional form of hominids, lived between 250 and 125,000 years ago. These are probably late varieties of Homo heidelbergensis and also represent the very earliest versions of our own species, early modern Homo sapiens, or as they're sometimes called, anatomically modern Homo sapiens. Finally, we'll look at the end of this talk at the rise of the group 3 hominid fossils, fully modern humans, between 125 and 70,000 years ago. Fully modern Homo sapiens, both in biology and skeletal morphology, but also the very beginnings of cultural and behavioral patterns that we recognize as being us, in particular, artistic expression. Indications in the archaeological record that not only have we physically developed into fully modern humans, but also behaviorally we are now acting like the species we recognize today as ourselves. So early to middle Pleistocene sites that are important, or the group 1 hominids, roughly 600 to 250,000 years ago, are shown in this map, really beginning as circles, a shaded circle, and in particular those white circles that you see in this map in that period between 650 and 300,000 years ago, the middle Pleistocene period. So Europe presented challenges for hominid species, primarily because during the Pleistocene, it was cold, much colder than tropical Africa, where our species originated, our genus originated as well. So we are tropical primates, basically. We're not really suited for the cold. But as you can see, as early as 1.4 million years ago, your hominids did get into southern Europe, in particular at sites like Grandolina, Cima de los Huesos. In that area of the Pyrenees, we have some very early hominids in what is the warmer parts of Europe. Expansion north of the Alps was particularly difficult at this time. We just didn't have the technological, cognitive, cultural capabilities that we would later have to be suited to the colder temperatures north of the Alps in Central and Northern Europe. This requires very specific adaptations. In particular, it includes the controlled use of fire. So until we figured out how to create campfires at will, and maybe some advances in clothing, we had a difficult time living in the colder environment. So we're still kind of stuck to the south, warmer, temperate environments. Homo heidelbergensis expansion outside of Africa would have occurred during this period. In the emergence of early modern humans, Homo sapiens in Africa probably occurred just towards the end of this period, and maybe as a group 2 hominid. We also would see the very beginning of the evolution of a species known as Homo neanderthalensis in Europe, or the Neanderthal. Neanderthal is because it evolves from its ancestor Homo heidelbergensis in Europe, in situ in Europe, it is a biological response to those cold conditions. So Neanderthals are more specifically biologically adapted to living in Central Europe than its predecessors are. And we will discuss the evidence behind this line of thinking in this talk. So let's begin with evidence for the controlled use of fire. Homo ergaster may have used some natural fires as early as 1.5 million years ago. There is some evidence to suggest that, but this would have been rare and probably not very common. And there's some debate as to whether or not Homo ergaster actually knew how to produce fire rather than, say, capturing a lightning strike on the landscape and trying to keep it going because it was sort of a mystery how to produce fire on their own. But it does suggest that hominids may have been losing that natural fear of fire that most animals in the wilderness have. There's evidence between 670 and 400,000 years ago at a site called Zukudiin, or Dragon Bone Hill in China, where Homo erectus probably used fire. And that far north in China, it would have been quite cold. Fire would have been a key to surviving. Fire was necessary to colonize these northern latitudes. So our ancestors needed to be able to figure out how to produce fire at will and to control it in a way that could help them survive in a form of pyrotechnology. In Europe, controlled fire was definitely used by 400,000 years ago at sites in Hungary, at Schöningen, Germany, and there are many other examples that we can talk about where we have evidence that our ancestors were able to produce fire. Homo heidelbergensis between 600 and 400,000 years ago, if we focus just on this particular individual, we know that heidelbergensis evolves first in Africa and then spreads to Eurasia at a time that's coeval with the lithic technology of the advanced Acheulean hand axes and an industry known as, that would later become known as the Mousterian of the Acheulean Tradition, an early version of what is to be known as the Mousterian Tradition. So there were some innovations by Homo heidelbergensis or their immediate ancestors that indicated some further cognitive abilities. We also know that the cranial capacity is quite large here of heidelbergensis in comparison to its predecessors, reaching sizes of 1,225 to 1,300 cubic centimeters. Heidelbergensis at Schöningen, Germany, shows evidence for the controlled use of fire. In particular, we have, if you can believe it, 300,000-year-old wooden spears that were sharpened at the tip, but then those spear tips were charred in a fire to make them harder. So heat treated of these wood spears to make them a little more robust at the point. These kinds of adaptations helped heidelbergensis survive in what were essentially Ice Age conditions of Europe. Creating fire-hardened spears also suggests that heidelbergensis was a proficient hunter. So we are now well out of the scavenging for meat and bone marrow stages of our hominid evolution and actively pursuing hunting as a top predator within an ecosystem. The other key point is that heidelbergensis is ancestral to two lineages of hominids, Homo neanderthalensis and Homo sapiens. Homo neanderthalensis evolved in Europe and spread towards the east into Eurasia. proto-Neanderthal specimens appear as early as 400,000 years ago, up to 250,000 years ago, with cranial capacities that exceed that of modern humans. Neanderthals are robust. They're shorter and broader, and they have a larger cranial capacity as part of that cold weather adaptation, the biological adaptation to colder conditions. This gave them a cranial capacity between 1,125 and 1,550 cubic centimeters. The average adult Neanderthal cranial capacity is 1,450 cubic centimeters. Homo sapien, on the other hand, evolved in Africa and then spread out to colonize the world. Early modern humans, or transitional forms that appear towards the end of the 400 to 150,000 year date range, had cranial capacities as large as, well, as small as 900 and as large as 2,000. So there's great variability among Homo sapiens. The average cranial capacity for anatomically fully modern humans is 1,350 cubic centimeters. So let's talk now about the Middle Paleolithic and the European origins of the Neanderthal, which occurred between 400 and 200,000 years ago. We might call these proto-Neanderthals, or precursors to the Neanderthal. Transitional fossil forms, meaning some in this period you would see their fossils have traits that indicated both Homo heidelbergensis and as well derived traits of the Neanderthal. So these are in between fossil forms. They're both heidelbergensis and Neanderthal, basically, as one evolves into the other. Some early versions include Swanscombe in England and Steinheim, Germany. We also want to mention a very important site, Cima de los Huesos at Atapuerca in Spain, where you see a combination of primitive and derived traits in these fossil forms. At Cima de los Huesos and also Sierra de Atapuerca sites, these are cavernous sites in the southern Pyrenees Mountains. You can see these skulls are intriguing. They, on one hand, resemble Neanderthal, but on the other, have unique attributes to them. The first thing you'll notice is they're very robust, thick-boned, heavy bones in comparison to a modern human. This other thing you might notice is sort of the rectangular eye and nose orbits rather than ovoid, and then a very pronounced lack of a chin, which is characteristic of Neanderthal. The foramen magnum at the base of the skull, obviously these are fully bipedal hominids that have been for quite a long time. And then look at the profile of the skull, which is sort of squat down on the top and a little bit rectangular as well. So that low-riding cranial vault, which is an ancestral trait to previous forms. So European origins of Neanderthal between 400 and 200,000 years ago. The Cima de los Huesos fossils have these derived traits, which are intermediate between heidelbergensis and the Neanderthal. They have double-arched brow ridges and a projecting mid-face. The cranial capacity is at the lower range of the classic Neanderthal specimens. So Neanderthal evolves in Europe. It is a uniquely European species, evolved from heidelbergensis, its African ancestor. So this brings up the question, which is the focus of a tremendous amount of research. Do we say that this is Homo neanderthalensis, or is it a subspecies Homo sapien sapiens? And either way, the classic Neanderthal specimen lives between 150,000 years ago and goes extinct shortly after 40,000 years ago, after fully modern humans spread into Europe, and after a brief period of overlapping coexistence, were swamped out genetically and replaced by fully modern humans. with some intermingling and hybridization occurring between the two species. So Neanderthals evolved during the Ice Age, so they are cold adapted species. They have shorter frames, very robust, broad, highly musculature, much stronger and robust than we are as fully modern humans. They also had like shorter leg and arm indices. So they are specifically evolved to exist in these cold environments. There's no evidence that they wore tailored clothing. Probably wore layers of animal furs, kind of like a poncho with a hole cut out for their head, but not stitched together with an needle or anything. They often use their teeth as tools, either to hold and grip things, or to as pliers, or maybe even as scissors. But there is dental wear on their teeth to suggest that they often use them as tools. As we've said several times, they're biologically adapted to the cold, and this may mean that they had distinct biological advantages that humans did not. A very broad nasal cavity that theoretically warmed the air a bit more before it entered the lungs. Significantly strong individuals and well suited to close contact with big game. There's very little archaeological evidence for artistic expression among Neanderthals, although you will find some that disagree with this. If there's any evidence at all for, say, the use of ochre or other artistic etchings or carvings, it's extremely rare among Neanderthals. And the majority of it in Europe, if it does exist at all, that is incontrovertible evidence of art or expression associated with Neanderthals, it's at the very end of their existence after they've been exposed to fully modern humans. So we mentioned this close contact with big game. Very famous study of bone breakage patterns shows that Neanderthal trauma, the paleopathology of their bone breakage on Neanderthal remains, is most consistent with modern-day rodeo riders, which suggests that regular close contact with angry, large animals was part of the lives of Neanderthals, just as it is part of the life of a modern-day rodeo rider. This is a tough existence. Neanderthals' average life expectancy is not much more than 40. Now, there are examples of Neanderthals that lived beyond 40, of course, but by and large, they are short-lived species. Trauma is fairly common, and it's consistent with this close contact with large game, meaning that they probably had to get very close to these animals that are much bigger and stronger and jab a sharp stick into them in order to kill them. This is not easy hunting. There's evidence for severe breaks that did heal, which indicates that they were taken care of by others as they healed. So there is some form of social organization here where they recognize the benefit of social cooperation and for caring of other individuals. Neanderthals did create simple hearths. They had the ability to control and produce fire. There's some evidence for plant material being used, although admittedly, this would not preserve as well as other forms of archaeological evidence. Some basic woodworking, consumption of legumes, peas and grasses, acorns, pistachios, and hackberry really make up the majority of their plant use. Meat was an essential part of their diet. They scavenged and hunted, and 90% of their diet was likely protein. This is consistent with hominid living in the far north cold environments, which require high protein, high calorie, high fat diet to burn and keep themselves warm. We know the Neanderthals often hunted medium-sized game like deer and bison. We also know they occasionally hunted bigger game like mammoth, and there were others available to them as well, rhinoceros or auroch in particular. They were opportunistic hunters, meaning they went out on forays away from their base and went out seeking animals that they might encounter on the landscape. So they could come home with a few rabbits, or they may get lucky and kill a woolly mammoth. The point being, though, that there's little evidence that they strategically planned special task forces to go and take specialized tools in order to hunt a particular animal in a particular location. That's something fully modern humans would do, a tactical, specialized task force sent out with the express idea of accomplishing a particular objective, as opposed to a haphazard meandering around in a foray around your base camp with the hopes of encountering some game. So Neanderthals spread into Europe and did quite well. Here's a map of Neanderthal sites, and in circles, and the triangles are locations of suspected Neanderthal burials. And you can see here the extent of the late Pleistocene glacial maximum ice sheet and the Middle Pleistocene glacial maximum ice sheets. The Middle Pleistocene maximum would have been directly related to the Neanderthal species, but by the time the late Pleistocene glacial maximum advance occurred, Neanderthals had already gone extinct and were replaced by modern humans. We do know Neanderthals spread further into the east. You see here this orange circle highlighting the known world of the Neanderthal. What is unknown is the relationship of Neanderthals specifically to the more recent discovery of the Denisovans in Siberia. It's not fully understood the connection between the evolution of Denisovans, but they are very similar genetically to Neanderthals. However, the point at which they diverge from any common ancestor is not yet fully known. Let's talk a little bit about the Mousterian tradition, which would have been a stone tool tradition that was developed first by heidelbergensis and widely used by Neanderthals. This is a fairly sophisticated stone tool industry that employs what is known as the level wall flaking technique, or this triangular style level wall way of making tools. It's based on flakes. There are blades, and these are simple tools: scrapers, knives, points. There are hand axes and chopping implements. And then there are some use of antler and bone tools, but it's not extensive. So sophisticated in that there's a wider variety of tools that are used, and it's easy to produce a tool from a very particularly shaped level wall core. So as opposed to Acheulean, where quite a lot of effort is put into the reduction of a stone core into a particular tool type, the Acheulean hand axe. In the case of the Mousterian, the tool industry is far more versatile and flexible, in that a lot of effort and energy is put into the creation of the core so that a different kind of a flake tool or a level wall projectile can be easily dispensed or produced when necessary and when needed. And then that can be converted into another tool if needed. So you get more and more variety in the types of tools available with the Mousterian over the Acheulean. Let's talk a bit about Neanderthal behavior, in particular burials. Not very many hominid species before humans are known to have buried their dead, but Neanderthal is one of them. We can say that it wasn't widespread, it wasn't always practiced, but we do know that some Neanderthal groups buried some of their dead. there is little to no evidence of ritual behavior associated with Neanderthal burials. So while older reports from the 1960s at Shanidar Cave in Iraq argued that flowers were placed in the graves of Neanderthals, that would signify some significant ritual behavior. However, subsequent studies learned that the pollen flower that was discovered was more or less ubiquitous in the soils across the cave floor and not unique to the burial of the Neanderthal themselves. So we're left with little to no actual burial goods or ritualistic behavior beyond the burial of individuals. So burials are also rare, we should point out. There are less than 20 known examples of Neanderthal burials, meaning most of the time they did not bury their dead. The graves are rather shallow. Some are actually disputed as to whether or not they are actual burials or not. So the evidence is there, but there's very little of it. A couple of good burial sites suggest repeated burials. Shanidar Cave in Iraq and La Ferracie in France. Indicate that Neanderthal burials did occur. So some fossil evidence for the evolution of Neanderthal. If we look at this table from our text, our readings, we have a column for species, the time range, key early sites, and the particular morphology that highlight the evolution of Neanderthals. And it starts with early pre-Neanderthals or proto-Neanderthals that are more than 300,000 years old at sites like Cima de los Huesos in Spain, sites in France and Petrolona in Greece have Neanderthals or proto-Neanderthals within them. There's some morphological differences between them and the classic Neanderthal species, which occur between 70,000 and we'll say 40,000 or slightly after 40,000 years ago, like at Saint Cesar in France and La Chapelle aux Saints and other sites. There are some important European Neanderthal fossils to make note of at Spee in Belgium, Krapina in Croatia, L'Aquina in France, La Moustière in France, among others. Let's move now to this group 2 transitional hominids in Africa and what comes out of that population between 250 200,000 years ago. They are geographically isolated in southern Africa at this time. They are the earliest versions of Homo sapiens in Africa. We know in Europe during this window there's proto-Neanderthal that's existing, about to evolve into a classic form of Neanderthal. And way over in East Asia, Homo erectus is still around. What we see in all three of these is, one, they're geographically isolated from each other at this point in time. They're not exchanging their gene pools at 250 to 200,000 years ago. They're closely related because they share a common ancestor that's not that far back in time. Although Neanderthal and Homo sapiens would be more closely related than Homo erectus over in East Asia. One thing we see in all of these species, though, is an increasing brain size, that encephalization or increasing cranial capacity, the volume of the brain is going up. Behaviorally, though, they're still quite primitive and they all more or less act the same at 250 to 200,000 years ago. There may be some slight difference in stone tool technologies, but they're more or less doing the same type of thing. This sets the stage for the ultimate game of hominid evolutionary risk, or survival of the fittest by natural selection. Which of these three species will emerge and replace the others in a form of expansion and replacement? The answer to that question should be obviously clear. Homo sapiens, between 250 and 200,000 years ago, there is a small range of stone artifacts that represent Homo sapiens. They did not build structures that really would be visible archaeologically, and they probably had tents. They more or less used caves. They behaved like their cousins in Europe, the Neanderthal. Toolkits varied little over long periods of time and space, and like Neanderthal, they used some, but not very much, bone, antler, or ivory. There's also little to no evidence for artistic, creative expression. So Neanderthals are more closely related to Eurasian populations of Homo sapiens than they are to Africans. And what this suggests is that while these species are evolving separately, Neanderthals are undergoing their own biological evolutionary trajectory in Europe. Fully modern humans are undergoing their evolutionary trajectory in Africa. But at some point, they come into contact with one another, first probably in Southwest Asia, and they begin swapping genetic material, interbreeding with each other, and producing viable offspring. And the reason we know this is by analyzing the genomes of Neanderthals, comparing them to the genomes of different human geographic groups, the French, the Han Chinese, and African groups like the San or the Kalahari Bushmen, the Hong Bushmen in southern Africa. So to reiterate, modern human populations existing today outside of the continent of Africa share genetic material with Neanderthal. And if we look at them closely, the French are more closely, or Europeans in particular, are more closely related genetically to Neanderthals because of admixture than the Han Chinese. They share more genetic material. This is not to say that fully modern humans evolved out of Neanderthals. We did not. We evolved from a shared common ancestor in Africa at a previous time, between 250 and 200,000 years ago. It's not until 40,000 years ago when we begin to come into contact with Neanderthals in Europe. It's at that point that there is some hybridization between the two species that were previously geographically isolated. So Homo sapiens between 200 and 50,000 years ago begin to see some changes. While we're very similar to our predecessors in all respects, except for the complete control use of fire is totally widespread across the species, we're much more proficient hunters. We make a much wider variety of stone tools, and we begin to use artistic expression as a species. We start to see the use of ochre. We begin to see the use of engravings or etchings. And this begins shortly after 100,000 years ago in southern Africa. So Homo sapiens, not a sure thing. There's at least one dispersal out of Africa by 100,000 years ago, but we fall back into the continent. This was not really successful. We're followed by a population bottleneck where our species around 90,000 years ago had less than about 10,000 individuals on the planet. So it's a near extinction event because of climate changes, Pleistocene, and we just weren't thriving at 90,000 years ago. But something happened at that time. It reduced us to very small pockets in southern Africa. Something happened during that period, and we begin to increase our numbers certainly after 70,000 years ago. We somehow recover as a species, and we begin to colonize the entire world. I'll just note that it's in that period of the bottleneck that we begin to see expressions of art and ochre use. So here we can compare the three main players, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo neanderthalensis, and what used to be called Cro-Magnon or early fully modern humans. There are some differences biologically between the modern Neanderthal male and the modern human male. The Neanderthal has the long clavicle and broader chest, wide scapula, much more muscle, stronger, indicated by greater muscle attachments to what are more robust long bones, thicker walled bones, large shoulders, very large rib cage with very barrel chest, and the joints are bigger, just much more robust, even though they're shorter. Hands have very strong grip with wide fingertips and rounded curve, thick-walled femoral shafts. More, even though they're more resistant to breakage, we see more breakage in the Neanderthal populations than we do in modern humans, which tend to be more gracile. So we could say that the Neanderthal is more robust, even though it's shorter, and the fully modern human is more gracile, slightly taller. The archaeological evidence for fully modern human behavior begins after 100,000 years ago, that genetic bottleneck in our population. This includes an increased typological diversity and standardization of artifacts. We see greater frequencies of artifacts that resemble or artifact assemblages that change over time. We see faster innovation and evolution of our technology, shaping of organic materials like bone and antler and ivory by carving them into formal categories such as implements, needles, awls, harpoons, pendants. We see jewelry or items of personal adornment like pierced shells and carved organics, often transported across the landscape and moved around. There's incontrovertible figurative and non-figurative art that appears among fully modern humans in Southern Africa. Use of space is clearly organized, not haphazard and messy like the Neanderthal, but there are distinct categories of activity areas, like this is where we cook our meals, this is where we flint knap our stones, this is where we dispose of our trash. These are clear signs of spatial organization, including dwelling structures, elaborately constructed, sophisticated fire hearths, and that is a material representation of a more highly organized cognitive ability, and along with art, a higher ability for symbolic thinking, cognitive behavior. The transport of lithic raw materials or stone over longer distances occurs more and more frequently as it's recognized what the better resources are and the need to move them across the landscape at greater distances. We see broad spectrum economies develop, incorporating small terrestrial animals, marine resources, vegetable resources, and often requiring trapping and processing technologies, grindstones for processing other foods. Food storage begins to show up in some forms, prey selectivity and large mammal hunting, these specific task force and specific technologies for different types of foods. All of this means that fully modern humans are able to extract significantly more food resources from the same environmental contexts than our ancestors and our relatives, Neanderthals. These types of skills of occupations that allow us to colonize more difficult and challenging environments, allow us to weather colder temperatures, even though we're tropically adapted for hotter environments. And it shows a growth in our population in size and numbers. And eventually, it's these cultural adaptations that results in the replacement of Neanderthal and Denisovans in the north by the African Homo sapiens. So in our next talk, we will discuss the rise of fully modern humans, our spread out of Africa, and our colonization, our ultimate colonization of the entire world, except for Antarctica, of course. So I want to thank everyone for your attention. We've been reviewing here the Scarre book, The Human Past, and I've obtained some of these images through Google Images and Bing searches using Creative Commons copyright material. A few of the images of the skulls come from bone clones, and I thank everyone for your attention.